Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you the new king of Necromancer builds. So with that, let us jump right into the video. Now before we get started with the build, I actually want to talk about what this build is and what it does and why it is probably the best build that we'll ever see for Necromancer. Now this is going to take a second as this build is absolutely insane. Now looking at it, you'll notice we don't use a basic skill or a core skill at all. But yet this build can still one-shot bosses. Yes, you heard that. It can completely one-shot bosses. And not just any bosses, but Uber Lilith. Now someone by the name of Rob, who is a popular Diablo 4 streamer and YouTuber, he was able to get a 330 million damage crit on Uber Lilith with this build and one-shot her as soon as she spawned. Now that is going to be the build I'm bringing you with a few tweaks that I think actually make the build a little bit better. Specifically in the Paragon Board and in a couple of the actual skill points, I didn't like where they were, and so I changed them to tweak them to my playstyle and my build better. So overall, that's what I'm going to be bringing you. I'm going to be showing you how to play it, how it works, and it is honestly a blast. Seeing the huge damage numbers that come off this is by far stronger than any Bone Spear build in the game, and it is way stronger than any build I have seen on any of the other classes. Now, of course, the reason for this is the new Barber Heart, the Wrathful Heart. Now, I do want to make it known that right now the Barber Heart is being looked at the dev team about whether it needs to be toned different, changed, or nerfed. Now, we don't have any details about if that's going to happen, and it very likely could stay exactly like it is, as they said the actual heart isn't functioning in the way it's not supposed to. It's functioning how it's supposed to. It is just incredibly strong. And they said with it being a Wrathful Heart, it is supposed to be incredibly strong. So until we have more information, I'm going to say that this is actually going to stay in the game as it is. So with that, let's jump right into the skill tree. All right, and we are now going to be going through the skill tree in-game because the Mobalytics website actually has a problem with the skill tree right now where the ultimate ability section does not exist. So if you go to the build right now, it will not have the ultimate ability section, which we do spend quite a few points in. So for now, they are working on that. I have contacted with their team, and they said they are trying as fast as they can to resolve the problem. Now, hopefully by the time this video is up, that bug will no longer be a thing. But if it is, just know that if you want to see the skill tree, please just slow down the video and follow this. Now, as we look at it, let's go in here. And we're going to start out with Reap. And we're going to put 3 points all the way to Act Like Troop, but we are not going to use this at all. We are going to just let it sit in the back burner using 3 points and do nothing with it. Now, as we move down here, we're of course putting 3 points in Hued Flesh. This is just so we make some extra corpses. Now again, 1 point into Blood Mist, and then all the way into Ghastly. This is going to be basically our main way of traversing through the entire dungeon. As with this build, it is very close to an Infinimist build, meaning that we should have Blood Mist 24/7, 100% uptime with this build. Now, of course, this is a minion build, so Skeletal Warrior Mastery, Corpse Explosion, all the way up to Blighted Corpse Explosion for some darkness damage and some shadow damage. Bone Prison, 1 point, all the way to Ghastly Bone Prison. And then, of course, 1 point in Grim Harvest and 3 points in Fueled by Death for some extra damage. Now, as we move down here, we have Amplified Damage for increased damage by cursed enemies. Now we're going to be cursing our enemies with Decrepify, but we are not actually going to be casting this skill. We're going to go all the way down to Abhorrent Crepify for some extra lucky hit. And it's going to decrease our active cooldowns by 1 second. Now we are not going to be casting this. We are going to be using the Sacred Heart for this that does this automatically in an aura around us. It is going to automatically affect any enemy near us. Now of course, Skeletal Mage Mastery, this is a big one as our mages do a ton of damage in this build. Now, as we move down here, we have a point in Corpse Tendrils all the way to Plagued Corpse Tendrils, basically meaning a second application of Vulnerable just to make sure every enemy is vulnerable. Now, 1 point in Necrotic Carapace just to make sure to get us some Fortify and some base life. And then we're going to be at 1 point in Reaper's Pursuit. It's going to give us a little bit of movement speed after doing a shadow damage. And then 2 huge bonuses to our overall darkness and shadow damage skills. This is really where a lot of the damage in this build comes from. As we move down here, of course, 1 point into our Bone Storm, our ultimate ability, into Prime, and then into Supreme. Now, this is actually going to keep our skeletons alive the entire time. First, we have Inspiring Leader, basically meaning that our minions are going to be gaining attack speed while they are healthy, which is great. Basically, this is going to mean they can't lose more than 30% of their maximum life as they are being hit. And when the Skeletal Priest awakens, basically when you press the button to raise skeletons, when you have full skeletons, you'll summon the Skeleton Priest that will give them a 30% damage increase and will also heal them for 60% of their entire health. I like to do this once in the beginning or in the middle of every fight, and my skeletons never die. Now, as we move down here, we of course are going to be using Shadow Blight, and basically what this is going to do is it is going to give us a very big damage multiplier every time we deal shadow damage. Now, overall, this is a very strong key passive, and we're going to be buffing it with 2 aspects in the skills, as you'll see. So this is going to cover the skill tree. Next, we are going to move on to some gear, some aspects, and the Book of the Dead. I hope you all enjoy. The rest of this guide should be in the Mobalytics app to take a look at. And with that, everyone, let's move on. Now, I want to move on to our Book of the Dead. So we are going to be using Reapers, and we're going to make it so that they form corpses more often with mages and make it so they do a little bit of extra damage. And of course, we are going to be sacrificing our Golem for a 30% critical strike chance. Now, in this build, critical strike is very important, and so are lucky hits, as you will see. As you'll see, we are using 2 weapons on a Necromancer, which is pretty rare, as most builds either use a 2-handed sword or a 2-handed scythe. We are going to be using a wand and a focus. Now let's get actually into the aspects here, starting with the helm, the aspect of explosive mist. Basically, when we're in explosive mist, it is going to cause corpse explosions on the surrounding corpses and is going to reduce the cooldown of blood mist. Basically, this is going to make it so that blood mist is popping super often, super fast, constantly, and it's going to make sure that we get our blood mist constantly as we're always creating corpses and we're using them. It's going to reduce the cooldown. Now, vicious aspect, this is going to increase the number of skeletal mages, as skeletal mages do far more damage than skeletal warriors, as they are also doing shadow damage. So we will make sure we have the max number of skeletal mages possible. Now, as we move down here to the aspect of decay, basically this is just a buff to our Shadow Blight key passive, making it a little bit stronger, which is honestly going to help huge with our damage and it's going to make it much better. Now, aspect of disobedience to give us a little bit of survivability when we're not in blood mist, seeing as we are going to gain armor for 4 seconds when we deal any percent of damage, and we're constantly doing damage, so we're constantly going to have some extra armor just in case our blood mist falls off, so you don't get one shot. And of course, we're using the Ghost Walker aspect. This is going to make it so that we can move faster while unstoppable, which is in blood mist. So we'll be able to move faster in blood mist and can move freely through enemies even faster. Overall, this is going to make it so you can travel farther in blood mist, do more damage, and get to enemies. Now, next, we were going to talk about the aspect of Grasping Veins. Basically, it's going to be buffing our critical strike chance when we cast Corpse Tendrils, and we're going to deal bonus damage to the enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils. This is great, since all of the enemies should be constantly being damaged by Corpse Tendrils, and we're going to be using it. This is a huge damage buff for us. Now, of course, we are going to be looking at the Ring of Mendelin, which is a unique that honestly makes this build about 5 times stronger. Yes, so when you have 7 or more minions, you gain up to a 10% chance to empower all of your minions, causing the next attack from each to explode. And this is why I call it the bomber build, is pretty much every bit of damage we're doing is an explosion. So not only is it going to do huge damage to the main target, but damage to all of those who surround it, which with Corpse Tendrils, they should be very tight and everyone should be sharing that damage as it stacks and stacks. Now, of course, we're going to use Blighted Aspect for our last one, basically dealing increased damage after the Shadow Blight key passive damages an enemy. Basically, this is going to be buffing the damage after the Shadow Blight passive kicks off, which should be kicking off constantly since we are constantly doing shadow damage. Now, one of the benefits of speccing for critical hit and using 2 weapons is we get an extra aspect. So we're using Osidious Gale aspect, basically making our Bone Storm consume 8 courses and making it last longer. This is great. It's going to make our Bone Storm last longer so we can stay in it for as long as possible. And of course, we have the aspect of Ultimate Shadow. This is a very important one in this build. Basically, Bone Storm and Blood Wave, which we are not using Blood Wave, are darkness skills that deal shadow damage and gain additional effects. Enemies damaged by Bone Storm take shadow damage over 2 seconds. Now, as we move down into the hearts, we are going to be using the Sacrilegious to automatically activate our Corpse Tendrils and our Corpse Explosions. And of course, we're using the Decrepit Aura to make sure that enemies around us are constantly being afflicted with the curse Decrepify. And then, of course, we are using the most important heart in this build, the Barber. This is going to make it so that you can deal absolutely insane damage in one-shot bosses. So just a quick thing about how the Barber works. It's going to take the damage that you do in critical strikes and all damage after it for 4 seconds. It's going to be compounding it by 15% per second, going up and up and up to where you can hit crits into the tens to hundreds of millions. to where you can absolutely one-shot the hardest boss in the game. The Barber is incredibly strong, and it does some stuff that is kind of weird. If you are in a party, your party members will notice that when they do a critical hit, it is also getting absorbed. So if you're in a party, you are dealing absolutely insane crits, as you are even absorbing your party members' crits into that Barber explosion. Now, of course, for our armor, we are going to be using a ruby just to get some maximum life, and of course, emerald for the critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Next, let's take a quick look at the Paragon Board. All right, now here with the Paragon Board, we are not going to go into crazy detail, but we are going to look at some of the highlights of the board. Now, starting off with the starter board, we are going to be using Amplify, and then we're going to move on to Scent of Death, where we are going to be using Control, and we are going to be using the legendary aspect here. Now, if you're leveling, you have a choice here to go left or up. Me personally, I would recommend you go up first, because you're going to go up, you're going to put in Scourge. Now, you're not going to go for this legendary node. You're going to go to the left, put in Essence, and we are going to be going for this node. This node is very important for this build late game, as when you consume 5 corpses, which should be pretty much constantly, as we're constantly generating them and consuming them, you're going to get a 40% increased damage. Now, this is a multiplicative 40%, meaning it does a lot more than just 40%. This is going to absolutely change the amount of damage that we are doing with this build. It is a very, very important part of this build. Now, early game, I do think it is more important to get these first. But like middle to late game, you should be like, I think 85-ish when you get this. This is when you need it. At 85, enemies are really going to start to be getting more challenging as you're pushing in higher nightmare content. Now, this is going to really help with that, and you're going to notice an explosion in the difficulty of content that you can do. Now, after you get this, I would recommend coming back down here and putting Exploit in this part. And then moving up to the final board, we're going to be putting Dead Razor, and we are going to make our way up to a few rare nodes, into the legendary node, and then into the rare node. Basically, this is just going to be buffing our minions, which is important, but not really as important as the other spots. The minions do a lot of damage and do especially help with clear and survivability, but overall, there are other stuff we need to focus on first, but this is definitely a nice part when you get to level 100. Now, that has been the build guide. There is some gameplay that I'm going to put at the end with just some music so you guys can watch this, how it's played. But before that, I want to talk about how you actually play this build. All right, so there's 2 scenarios when playing this build that should cover pretty much about everything in the game. Now, the first one being is when you're going into a dungeon and you are with a lot of enemies. Maybe there's 3 or 4 elites in the room. What should you do? Well, with this build, the first thing you should do is pop Bone Storm and then into Blood Mist. And the reason for this is if you pop Blood Mist first, you cannot pop Bone Storm. But as long as you do Bone Storm first and then Blood Mist, they will both activate at the same time. Now, next, you need to wade into as many enemies as possible, and this is to create corpses. So basically, what's going to happen, you're going to create corpses. Corpse tendrils will then go off, and will group everyone in the room together. Now, as everyone gets grouped in, you need to drop Bone Prison. Now, with this, when you drop Bone Prison, it is going to keep all of the enemies together, and it is going to make sure that you do a ton of damage. Now, as this is happening, all of your crits should be building up thanks to the Barber, and in one fell swoop, the whole room should die. Now again, rinse and repeat this. If you're doing everything right, you should have Blood Mist infinitely. Now you might not always have Bone Storm, and that is okay. Because if you don't have Bone Storm, just use Blood Mist without it to keep yourself alive and do the same thing. Wade into enemies, create, orbs with Blood Mist, wait till they're grouped together, drop Bone Prison, and then you can manually pop corpses with your Corpse Explosions button. Now again, if you don't want to do that, you can just go right back into Blood Mist, as it should be available 24/7. And then again, rinse and repeat. Now let's talk about bosses. So there's a little pre-work that you can do for bosses. As a boss spawns, first drop Bone Prison around them. This is going to make sure they're vulnerable right from the get-go. Now drop Bone Prison and then go into your combo of Bone Storm and then Blood Mist. Now swirl around the boss while this is happening, and you really shouldn't be doing damage in this phase. It should be all building within the Barber. Now, as you're doing this, you should run out of Blood Mist right before the Barber goes off, and just try and spam as many Corpse Explosions as you can before it goes off. Now, if you do everything right and you have a high enough level, you should one-shot that boss. You should probably get a hit between 10 million and 100 million on that boss. Now, of course, it might not one-shot it. If you don't get lucky with crits, it might only do half its health. So if it does half its health, just rinse and repeat. Your Bone Prison should be back up. You should have Blood Mist. Just rinse and repeat until the boss dies. Really, you might only have to do this once or twice. The boss should pretty much get one shot 100% of the time. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed. I hope to see you guys in the next video. And of course, there's going to be some gameplay after this so you can watch this build in action. Thank you, and I hope to see you guys in a future video.